This week we're going to be looking at the relationship between Russia and Israel. Now what we've seen is the development of Russia as an active and decisive player in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf and the Arab Peninsula region. We've seen a Russian state which is able to engage with some of the most steadfast allies of America. And Israel plays a key role in this whole dynamic when we look at not only the independence of Russian-Israeli relationships free of the United States, or the way in which Israel is able to impact Russian actions, or Russia able to impact Israeli actions regarding the civil war and crisis in Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian continued occupation, war and resistance, and also impact on Europe and the US's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and of course, the Iran deal. Israel and Russia have had what is deemed as a special relationship since 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, this comes after the postponement of relations after the Six-Day War in 1967, where the Soviet Union threw its ideological and military weight behind the Arab states, such as Syria, Iraq, Egypt and Jordan. What we've seen with the fall of the Soviet Union is a resurgence of Russian-Israeli relationships. And this also has to do with the large amounts of emigres that came from the Soviet Union during the 70s and 80s to the State of Israel. Also the fact that from roughly 1948 to 1953, there was a decent level of ideological relationships between some parts of the Israeli political system and the Soviet system, with the founding of many kibbutz, as well as Zionist laborism. There was a feeling of the State of Israel's left-wing origins being connected to the Soviet Union in a vague Central European, Eastern European ideological link. Fast forward to today, we see Russia trying to be more precise and pinpointed in its method, in trying to separate out the United States from its key allies in the region and bolster its own position around the world, especially within the Middle East. The most delicate point in all of this is that of the Iran deal. Russia, along with the EU and China, has come out fully in favour of the Iran deal. But we now see, with Trump and his administration reneging on that multilaterally negotiated deal, Israel finding a new ally in the White House, seemingly believing in its ability to take unilateral action, violating international treaties. This has given Israel much more flexibility. However, this has been countered by Russia's influence in the region. With Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war, it's meant that Israel is unable to make significant strategic moves against Iran, out of fear that it will come into contact with Russia, Iran's erstwhile ally in that proxy war. In that sense, what we see is the Russians, although not necessarily economically the match of America, being much more precise, pinpoint and effective on the ground and in terms of constructing their alliances within the region. Consider the three-part dynamic between Israel, Iran, Russia, but add into the mix Turkey. Turkey has its own designs in the region, especially when it comes to the security and diplomatic trade links with the Arab Peninsula nations, the Gulf monarchies such as Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, as well as we consider the impact of what's going on in Yemen. But what Russia's been able to do is build an alliance with states that actually have long histories of suspicion and tension with it. Turkey, Israel and Iran all have had in their past histories major tensions with Russia, both in its incarnation as a new Russian Federation and also as the Soviet Union. However, Russia has emerged as a much more reliable partner in the region, regardless of what your opinion is or what side you're on when it comes to the Syrian civil war. Russia is seen as a much more effective player, its air power in Syria being decisive, but also its ability to negotiate and stave off growing tensions between Israel and Iran, as well as Turkey and Iran, or Turkey in Israel. It's also meant that Turkish influence has had to be drastically measured and replaced with Russian influence when we look at the proliferation of Russian air bases around Syria, when we look at the re-engagement with Russia, with Saudi Arabia, Russian sovereign wealth funds investing in Saudi private finance initiatives. All this points to a much more assertive nation, which itself has major structural problems, but again, Russia being much more effective on the ground than the United States. With the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, we've seen the Russians being rather more muted of their criticism of the Saudi state's actions of Mohammed bin Salman. Now, one can suggest that this is a cynical ploy by the Saudis and the Russians, both seeing investment opportunities and strategic alliances in store if both were to play their cards right, especially when we think about finance initiatives or future investment conferences that have been in the mix over the past few weeks and months. Russia is constantly looking for ways in which to be more assertive and agile in its ability to weaken US influence and projection around the world, forging more strategic alliances with China in its One Belt initiative, but also growing its influence in Central Asia and now the Middle East. If it can build greater links with the Sunni monarchies, Gulf states, Iran and Saudi Arabia, this makes for a much more sophisticated political player in this part of the world. Where does this leave Israel? Israel is an avowed supporter of the United States two-state solution, or its path to peace. The problem is that we have a situation with the United States being far less relevant and far less effective. And this, of course, is not to do with Trump. Trump is a pretty big symptom, but this rot starts well before. In many ways, you could say that the seeds of it were sown during the middle days of the Cold War. The problem for Israel is that it's so firmly attached with the world's primary superpower, the United States, which is ineffective on the ground in terms of its strategic alliances, has chosen weak and ineffectual allies such as Saudi Arabia, that it's difficult for Israel to bolster its position in terms of public relations to the Western world, but also its effectiveness in terms of what it does regarding Hezbollah, or the occupation, or the way people perceive it, or its perceived greatest state adversary, Iran. Israel, at the moment, is boxed in numerous ways, and Russia is yet another corner which it finds itself driven into. It seems that Vladimir Putin holds all the cards when it comes to this relationship.